Well, that's the outline of an argument. It's only the bare beginnings of an argument. What might be some obvious objections to it? I think there are two pretty clear objections to the sort of thing I've just said. First, what I call the fluffy response, the fair trade nonsense, the alternative, for which I have, as I'm sure you know, very little time. Second, perhaps the rather more serious response, which was Adam Smith's, that capitalism is an exchange mechanism and not a way of life. And for that response, though I think it's in the end mistaken, I have some respect. So let me start with the first, because it's more fun. The argument is, well, that's what capitalism used to be like back in the 19th century, but it no longer is. Fair trade, tradecraft, all the rest of the fluffy bit. The Companies Act 2006 is, to quote the lovely bunch of people, the Corporate Responsibility Coalition. Here's what they say about it. It's the biggest shake-up of company law for 150 years. It requires for the first time company directors to consider their business's impacts on people and the environment. It also requires some of the largest businesses to make public these impacts in annual reports. Close quote. So it's not true that directors' duty is simply to maximise shareholders' profits. Again, to quote this wonderful coalition, they must have regard to a number of matters, such as the likely consequences of any decision in the long term, its employees' interests, the need to foster its business relationships with suppliers and others, and of course, the impact of its operations on the community and environment. This particular duty, set down in an Act of Parliament for the first time, encompasses the concept of enlightened shareholder value. New Labour at its best, ESV. ESV, we are told by these learned people, quote, requires directors to act in the collective best interests of shareholders. They've been reading Mao again. Through an inclusive approach, inclusive of course, that values building long-term relationships and rejects the notion of exclusive consideration of short-term financial benefits. And although there was, and I'm emphasising, was a time when business success was thought to be in conflict with society's aspirations for people who work in the company or in supply chain companies, for the long-term well-being of the community and for the protection of the environment. The law is now based on a new approach, pursuing the interests of shareholders and embracing wider responsibilities are complementary, not contradictory. But that's rubbish. It's mere window dressing, it's mere propaganda for the big society. As Hannah Ellis and Kate Hodgson point out, quote, ESV assumes that companies whose directors have regard to relevant social or environmental impacts are likely in the long term to perform better than those whose directors do not. So if taking into account the environment makes the company more profitable, then it'll take them into account. But not because to do so is a good thing, but because to do so is a means of furthering its own interests. Take the example of fair trade, giving producers a slightly higher price for their coffee beans or whatever. The producers are still being used merely as a means to the fair trade company's ends, even if they're marginally less abused in the process. Giving a slightly less inadequate price helps sell the product, we all buy it. Done. According to the fair trade people, a fair price, after all, is one that's presumably a little higher than an unfair price. But of course, it's being a little less unfair doesn't make it fair. Now, of course, what, if anything, would count as a fair price is a tricky issue. Here's a suggestion, only a suggestion, a price which enabled the seller to enjoy the same standard of living as the average buyer. Just imagine that for a moment. But the fact that we don't have a clear answer to that question doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter because it doesn't stop us seeing that such and such a price, one that comes nowhere near that, is simply not fair. After all, the producer of the coffee beans matters just as much as you or I. And to abuse people less, or even if that's really what you do think goes on, not to be unfair to people at all, is not of itself to conform to Kant's principle. To use someone merely as a means to an end is a very specific form of abuse. That's why the principle is so important. It's not the same as just being unfair or more unfair or less unfair. It's a much deeper matter. It's a matter of not treating people as people at all. That's to say, Kant's principle does not concern price, whether fair, unfair, or fairer. It concerns our fundamental relationships. And because we're not things, those relationships cannot be understood in terms of price. To make this clearer, let's recall that under capitalism, that price is a fair price which the market will bear. And we all know that every time we get on a train. That's to say, the price for which the producer is prepared to sell, whatever their circumstances, and that which the buyer is prepared to pay, whatever their circumstances. But that's not the real world at all. I know philosophers aren't supposed to talk about the real world, but I'll break that rule. What counts as fairness reflects our respective positions relative to each other. If I'm starving and need a loaf of bread, I'll pay a higher price for it, if I can, than someone who isn't starving, even if that leaves me a lot worse off than the latter person. If the coffee farmer has to sell their beans at a certain price in order to live at all, then that's what they'll do. If they were better off, if they were less reliant on selling their coffee beans, they'd hold out for a higher price. This is all really quite simple. Fairness between equals is one thing. Fairness between unequals, which is what we're talking about, is nonsense and amounts simply to screwing people for whatever you can get out of them. It's the structure of social relations that counts. In this case, the fact that the farmer has no choice but to sell her or his labour. It's that fact that the firm, whether it's fair trade or not, exploits. It uses people, both producers and customers, merely as a means to its end of making money. And the shareholders exemplify the fact. It's what Kant rightly rules immoral. Why? Because according to Kant's principle, we're fundamentally equal. We're all the same sort of thing, namely persons. That's for Kant what equality means.